It's all comedy in theory. We can laugh at what we need. It's all comedy in theory. We can laugh at what we want.
Welcome to It's All Comedy in Theory, a historic and hilarious look at who and what makes us laugh. I'm your host, Charlie Spink. In today's episode, we continue our look at the comics who committed their art to vinyl, especially those who ushered in the era of counterculturalism, which, as we all know, was the culture surrounding mass producing of kitchen counters. Granite versus linoleum, which side are you on? This was a pivotal time for society, politics, and, most of all, comedy. That's where we come in. In the beginning of counterculturalism, there was Lord Richard Buckley, an American stand-up comedian and recording artist who, in the 1940s and 50s, created a character that was, according to the New York Times, an unlikely persona. Part English royalty, part Dizzy Gillespie. The Baltimore Sun described him as a magnificent stand-up comedian. Buckley's work, his very presence, projected the sense that life's truths lie in the inextricable weaving together of love and irony, affection for all of humanity, married to laughter. He influenced contemporary figures like Lenny Bruce, Wavy Gravy, Del Close of Chicago's Second City Improv fame, George Harrison, Tom Waits, Frank Zappa, Robin Williams, Jimmy Buffett, and several credit Buckley for lyrics in their signature songs. Bob Dylan, in his book Chronicles, said, "Buckley was the hipster bebop preacher who defied all labels." But of course, coming from Bob Dylan, it sounded like, In the 1950s, Buckley hit his stride with his hip semantic delivery that he adapted from his peers Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Red Fox, Pearl Bailey, Count Basie, and Frank Sinatra. Ed Sullivan, a close friend of Buckley and a sexy doppelganger for President Nixon. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not a crook, and here are the Beatles. Sullivan reflected, he was impractical as many in his profession are, but the vivid Buckley will long be remembered by all of us. In his acceptance speech at the Second Annual Comedy Hall of Fame Awards, comedian George Carlin mentioned a long list of comedy influences that ended with the great, great, great Lord Buckley.
Yeah, here I is again, that's me, and there's you. And I dig all you cats out there whipping and wailing and jumping up and down and sucking up that fine juice and patting each other on the back and telling each other who the greatest cat in the world is.
That's right, praise the Lord, Buckley. Am I right? Dick Gregory was a comedian, best-selling author, and civil rights activist. Gregory became popular with his no-hold-barred sets, poking fun at the bigotry and racism in the United States. During his career, he was a staple in comedy clubs, appeared on television, wrote books, and released comedy record albums. Gregory was at the forefront of political activism in the 1960s, when he protested the Vietnam War and racial injustice. He was arrested multiple times and went on many hunger strikes. Gregory got his start in comedy in the Army, where he entered and won several talent shows. In the hopes of becoming a professional comedian, Gregory moved to Chicago, where he was part of the new generation of black comedians, including Nipsey Russell, Bill Cosby, and Godfrey Cambridge, all of whom broke stereotypical black characters. Gregory drew on current events, especially racial issues, for much of his material. In 1961, Gregory was working in the black-owned Roberts Show Club in Chicago when he was spotted by Hugh Hefner. He started his set with, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand there's a good number of Southerners in the room tonight. I know the South very well. I spent 20 years there one night. Last time I was down south, I walked into a restaurant, and this white waitress came up to me. She said, 'We don't serve colored people here.' I said, 'That's all right. I don't eat colored people. Bring me the whole fried chicken.' Then these three white boys came up to me and said, 'Boy, we're giving you a fair warning. Anything you do to that chicken, we're gonna do to you.' So I put down my knife and fork, picked up the chicken and kissed it. Then I said, 'Line up, boys.'" Gregory attributed the launch of his career to Hefner. Based on his performance at the Roberts Show Club, Hef hired Gregory to work at the Chicago Playboy Club. Gregory wrote and published a book, and since its initial 1964 run, the book has never been out of print. The New York Times wrote, "It's powerful, ugly, and beautiful. A moving story about a man who deeply wants a world without malice and hate." The book has been the subject of critical commentary. However, it remains his best-known work. Although Gregory's comedy was deemed controversial, his success was undeniable. He ranked number 82 on Comedy Central's list of the 100 greatest stand-ups of all time, and has his own star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame. Mort Sahl pioneered a style of social satire which pokes fun at political and current event topics using improvised monologues. His trademark persona is to enter the stage with a newspaper in hand, casually dressed in a V-neck sweater. Sahl made his professional stage debut in San Francisco's Hungry Eye nightclub in 1953. His popularity mushroomed like an atomic cloud during the 50s, said filmmaker Robert B. Weed, adding, simply put, Mort Sahl reinvented stand-up comedy. In 1960, he became the first comedian to have a cover story written by Time magazine, who dubbed him Will Rogers with Fangs. Sahl was not fond of television news, which he blamed for spoon-feeding the public and was responsible for the corruption and ignorance that may sink this country. TV executive Roger Ailes said that he saw him read a newspaper one day, and after a few hours, Sahl got up on stage with an entire evening's worth of new material. He was a genius. Television host Steve Allen, who originated The Tonight Show, claimed that Sahl was the only real political philosopher we have in modern comedy. His social satire performances broke new ground. He was considered a true revolutionary. It inspired many later comics, including Lenny Bruce, Jonathan Winters, George Carlin, and Woody Allen. Combined with his impeccable improvisational skill, Sahl's naturalness was also considered very unique. Woody Allen notes that other comics were jealous of Sahl's stage persona. After seeing Mort Sahl on stage, Woody Allen decided to give it a try. I'd never had the nerve to talk about it before, but then Mort Sahl, he came along with a whole new style of humor, just opening up vistas for people like me. There was a need for revolution. Everybody was ready for revolution, but some guy had to come along who could perform the revolution and be great. Mort was the one. He was the tip of the iceberg. Underneath were other people who came along, Lenny Bruce, Nichols and May, the Second City, but Mort was the vanguard for the group. Although Sahl acquired a reputation as an intellectual comedian, it was an image that he disliked and disagreed with. That's absurd, Sahl said. I was barely a C student. His audience included not only students of the hip public, but noted politicians, such as presidential candidate John F. Kennedy, who asked him to prepare a bank of political jokes that he could use at public functions. Kennedy liked his style of political satire and what he described as Sahl's relentless pursuit of everybody. Sahl became the first comedian to make a record album, the first to do college concerts, and was the first comedian to win a Grammy. Lenny Bruce was an American stand-up comedian, social critic, and satirist. He was renowned for his open, freestyle, and critical form of comedy, which contained satire, politics, religion, sex, and just a pinch of vulgarity. Bruce paved the way for counterculture-era comedians. His trial for obscenity is seen as a landmark for freedom of speech in the United States. Bruce released a total of 4 albums of original material on Fantasy Records. These albums were later compiled and re-released as the Lenny Bruce Originals. The 2 later records were produced and sold by Bruce himself. Starting in the late 50s, other unissued Bruce material was released by Alan Douglas, Frank Zappa, and Phil Spector. In the midst of a severe blizzard, Bruce gave a famous performance at Carnegie Hall at midnight, February 4th, 1961. It was recorded and later released as a 3-disc set. Bay Area comedian Nina G. is quoted from her upcoming book about stand-up comedy in San Francisco. Bruce would become influential to comedians for decades to come. Richard Pryor said of Bruce, "He's an original, baby. He busted down doors and created a new fucking way to laugh. He taught me not to go for the jokes because they're funny. Just tell the truth. Telling the truth may get you hell, but it also gets you to heaven. Thank you, Lenny. I love you, man." It's important not to look at Bruce's comedy and legacy as breaking taboos or challenging free speech. Many comedians feel like getting on stage and saying offensive things puts them as Bruce's descendants. Being naughty was not Bruce's legacy. It was his courage to say the things that he said. Using a derogatory name because a comedian is doing badly on stage and wants to shock the audience into laughing is very different from challenging how people think about others or a previously taboo subject. In 1965, a year before his death, Bruce gave one of his last performances in San Francisco. In 2003, the state of New York pardoned Bruce for his 1964 obscenity conviction posthumously, the first time this had happened in state history. In 2017, Rolling Stone magazine ranked him 3rd, behind his disciples Richard Pryor and George Carlin, on the list of the 50 best stand-up comedians of all time. Bruce was the Gertrude Stein of comedians, never popular himself because he was too cryptic or too scatological for popular taste. Nevertheless, he influenced a whole new generation of comics, just as Stein influenced Hemingway and a generation of writers. Her own work was a dead end, so was Bruce's. In 1969, syndicated columnist Sidney J. Harris said of Bruce, "In our pop culture in the last few years, matching the new sound of music has been the kind of humor exemplified by the Smothers Brothers, Laugh-In, Woody Allen, and the whole breed, whose secret source of strength was the late dark angel, Lenny Bruce." The Smothers Brothers, Tommy and Dick, had a trademark double act of performing folk songs, which usually led to arguments between the siblings. Tommy's signature line was, "Mom always liked you best." The brothers made their first professional appearance as a duo in February 1959 at the Purple Onion in San Francisco. They were a popular act in clubs and released several top 40 albums for Mercury Records, the most successful being Curb Your Tongue, Knave in 1964. The Smothers Brothers later went on to host the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Wonder how they got that gig, which featured several popular and sometimes controversial comedians. Despite its success, the show's material was critical of the political mainstream and sympathetic to the emerging counterculture that ultimately got them canceled. In the 1970s, comedy albums developed a reputation for being targeted towards college students and continuing the counterculturalism scene. Notable artists, amongst others, Lily Tomlin, David Steinberg, Robert Klein, and Cheech and Chong. Mary Jean Lily Tomlin is an Academy Award-winning American actress, comedian, writer, singer, and producer. Tomlin started her career as a stand-up comedian in the 1960s. Her breakout role was on the variety show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In from 1969 until 1973. In 1972, Tomlin released This Is a Recording, her first comedy album on Polydor Records. It contained Ernestine's run-ins with customers over the phone. The album hit number 15 on the Billboard 200, and for the next 40 years, it was the highest charting album ever by a solo comedian. She earned a Grammy that year for Best Comedy Recording. Tomlin's second album, And That's the Truth, featuring her character Edith Ann, peaked at number 41 on the chart and earned her another Grammy nomination. David Steinberg is a Canadian comedian, actor, writer, director, and author, known for his observational comedy about religion, himself, and everyday life. Steinberg, at the height of his popularity during the 1960s and 70s, was one of the best-known comics in the United States. He appeared on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, more than 130 times, second only to Bob Hope, and, fun fact, exactly 130 more times than Charlie Spink. While studying English literature at the University of Chicago, he decided to become a comedian after seeing Lenny Bruce perform. He finished school and was discovered by one of the founders of the Second City in Chicago. There, he performed with Robert Klein, Fred Willard, Peter Boyle, and Joe Flaherty. Robert Klein is an American stand-up comedian, singer, and actor. He had several comedy albums in the 1970s and has made a variety of TV and movie appearances, including hosting Saturday Night Live twice. Jerry Seinfeld called Klein his personal comedy hero. What's the deal with that? He's never even told jokes in a car! In the 1973 album, A Child of the 50s, Klein talks about his life as, spoiler alert, a child in the 50s. His next album, released in 1974, Mind Over Matter, included extensive discussion of the Watergate scandal and the title song about a kid who turned to humor to become popular. Klein's 1975 follow-up album, New Teeth, featured his on-stage work. A review of the album described it as the funniest album by a stand-up comic since George Carlin's Class Clown. Cheech and Chong were and will always be a comedy duo, consisting of Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong. The duo found commercial and critical success in the 1970s and 80s, with their stand-up routines, studio recordings, and feature films, which were based on the hippie and free love era. Cheech and Chong broke down barriers well before President Trump tried to put up walls. They had fresh takes on friendship, relationships, and they invented cannabis. Please, don't fact-check this unless you're really, really high. The duo met in Vancouver, British Columbia in the late 1960s. Chong was a Canadian citizen and an alum of Chicago's famed Second City. Cheech had moved to Canada from Southern California to avoid the draft at the height of the Vietnam War. The pair performed stand-up shows, released many successful comedy record albums, and starred in a series of low-budget films. Some of their best-known comedy routines are the songs Earache My Eye, Basketball Jones, and Sister Mary Elephant. Perhaps the most famous line is, Dave's not here. Where was Dave? Well, you'll have to tune into our next video to find out. Dave, we're coming for you. And we're still not done with comedy on vinyl. Maybe that's just the record skipping. This is on vinyl after all. In our next episode, we take a look at 3 very unique, incredibly funny, successful, and game-changing comedians who were some of the last to record on vinyl. These legends essentially turned counterculture into mainstream culture, and comedy has been better for it. Thank you for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button to get more. It's all comedy, in theory. I'm Charlie Spink, and you're very welcome.
It's all jokes, it's all good. Comedy, baby. Ha ha!